Well, hello from KCIW LP in beautiful Brookings, Oregon, and welcome to Curry Cafe. Every Sunday from 3 to 4, producer and host Ray Gary puts together a panel of volunteers and guests to discuss various topics of interest to our community. And we have a text line if you have questions or comments about our show, and that number is 541-661-4098. Again, 541-661-4098. Now here's Ray to tell us about today's show.
Well, welcome everybody to another edition of the Curry Cafe. And today we have kind of a different sort of show. We have a panel of, well, three if you include the two of us. But we also have Robin O'Sullivan, who is here to talk about the civil rights era in this country now. If you are old enough to remember it, you probably remember that it was a very turbulent time in this country. Along with the civil rights activism, there was also the war in Vietnam and quite a few other things. I don't know, I think it was probably even more turbulent than it is right now. So let me turn the mic over to Robert, and he can talk about what he's going to talk about.
I will talk about what I'm going to talk about. I'm talking from experience. I was involved in the civil rights movement from my teenage years, and I remember actually hearing Martin Luther King speak in Oakland when I must have been 15 or 16, and I was one of the only white people in the audience as far as I could see. It was a joyous event. King's base early on was largely in the black church, and there were many people clapping and singing and all that sort of stuff going on. And anyway, early on in my life, I saw the injustice that had happened in this country due to enslavement and its aftermath, and early on got involved. And I said in a former show in this thing, I had shared one thing in common. I got investigated by the FBI for my civil rights leadership. And even though I was a pre-ministerial college student in a conservative Lutheran denomination, but like some of my other fellow students, I recognize that if you take the Christian faith seriously, you look at everybody as a child of God, and you don't make distinctions and rejections based on things that are really not important. We're all humans. We're on this planet together. And as King wrote in his final book, which was titled, "Where Do We Go From Here? Community or Chaos?" And obviously he, as an advocate of the blessed community and of justice for all, was on the side of community, but chaos is what happens otherwise, and we're seeing that more and more these days. Now, about King himself, he grew up in a rather stable, kind of middle-class black preacher family in Atlanta. His father was the head minister at Ebenezer Baptist Church, one of the main black churches in Atlanta. And he was a strong figure. He had his faults, and those who have tried to psychoanalyze King since those days said that often King was struggling with his own struggle with his own father about issues of authority and that sort of thing. While growing up, there were two incidences that had a big impact on him and shaped his life after that. Before he went to any school, he had a playmate who was white during ages 3 and 4 or 5 or whenever you start kindergarten. And they, just like young kids anywhere, played together and became friends. And then they went to school, and suddenly the white boy couldn't play anymore with young, well, he wasn't yet named Martin Luther King. He was Michael L. King at the time. And they just could no longer play together. And finally, the boy at school told him why. And it was because his father had forbade it. It wasn't right. This is not what goes on in the Jim Crow South. And that was the first real to-the-heart feeling that Martin Luther King had about race and justice and all that goes with it. Another incident was when he was about 14. He was already in high school and was about to go to Morehouse College the next year at age 15. But at 14, he and one of his teachers went by bus back and forth to a oratorical contest somewhat away from home in Atlanta. And on the way back, he and his teacher, who was black, were seated in the bus, but they stopped at some small town between where the event had happened and going back to Atlanta. And he and his teacher were forced to stand up for the rest of the 19 miles of the trip. And that influenced him deeply and influenced the history that followed. And his teacher said they had to do it because it was a law, and it was a law in the Jim Crow South that such things could happen. And anyway, those were two formative events in his life that he often mentioned later in his life because that was part of who he was. And incidentally, he did get to Morehouse College at a young age. His father may have, who was a friend of the president, may have had something to do with all that. And he was not a great student there. And for one thing, his reading level was not terribly high because he had been attending all-black schools that didn't teach very well. And although it's interesting, that show on CNN, a kind of attempt at humor, I forget what they're calling it, wanted us to identify who were people who were in college at age 15, and they turned out to be Martin Luther King and Sharon Stone, which is a very interesting combination.
If I could interrupt you for just a second,
Sure.
That's where I learned that little factoid, watching that show last night, and I would recommend that show to everybody, and I will as soon as I remember the name of it. It's that's news to me. Right. I think.
Something like that.
And in case you're wondering, and you don't know what happened to Roy Wood Jr., who should have been the rightful heir to the host spot on the Daily Show.
Yeah.
I mean, I think everybody was rooting for him or Desi Lysak. So
Yep.
Anyway, he didn't think he was going to get it, so he quit the show to go on to go back to doing stand-up, and there's other ways he had of making money, and he got this show, and it's incredibly funny. Have you seen it?
I've seen bits of it while channel surfing, and I saw those names together, and I thought I knew the answer to that, and I was right. So.
Oh, okay.
Well, meanwhile, back at Morehouse College, historic black colleges and universities played an important part in the civil rights movement. The two most prominent were Howard in Washington, D.C., and much of the legal talent and others who led in the movement came out of that. But Morehouse was kind of another one of the great historic HBCUs. And at Morehouse, King became acquainted with a very strong and powerful president of the college, whose name I'm forgetting for a second, but it will come back soon. And Benjamin Mays was the name of the man who was there. And in his readings, he later talked about what was the most important reading during his college years, and that was the essay called On Civil Disobedience by Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau, we often think of as this rather unusual man who went to live in a cabin by a lake for a year or so and wrote some and had a extremely wonderful appreciation of nature. And I remember he's credited with saying that weeds are simply fine plants whose better features have yet to be appreciated. But there was an incident in Thoreau's life that not too many people know about, although there was actually a play on Broadway about it years later. And this was at the start of the Mexican War. Now, U.S. history has always been a history of expansion, and in the process, it's involved genocide, it's involved wars that were not at all justified, and but it's the treatment of Indians, the Trail of Tears, many other things of that sort illustrate that. But here, the Mexican War was thought to be very popular, and it was trumped up. In Congress, there was only one person who voted against it, the Barbara Lee of his day, and that was Abraham Lincoln. He was the only vote, and the next time he was up for re-election to Congress, he lost. And so Lincoln was against the war, and so was Thoreau. And Thoreau was supposed to pay a tax to help support this war, and he refused, and he was incarcerated for refusing to pay a tax to support this ungodly, terrible, racist war that was going on in the American West.
This wasn't a tax specifically for the
I believe
war,
it was. I don't know.
Well, we didn't have income tax in those days.
They didn't, but they had a way of. Congress had power to allocate and get. And anyway, he wound up in jail, and a good friend of his was Ralph Waldo Emerson, the famous transcendentalist philosopher and thinker and all that. And he confronted Thoreau and said, "Why are you in jail?" And his answer was, "Why are you not in jail?" Anyway, the essay on civil disobedience is one of the basic pieces of literature behind the nonviolent movement that King so exemplified and led. And he was exposed to it while 15 or 16 while at Morehouse College. And it has the basic assumption that if something is evil, you should not cooperate with it. You should resist nonviolently to it and try to make a better world by your own actions, even if you have a different drummer, to use Thoreau's phrase, that even if everyone else is marching along with a band and you're not in step with them. And I found myself much of my life being of that vintage.
Me too. That's the story of my life. It's the reason I've been so successful.
You know, Robert, I wanted to go back. By the way, this is Rick McNeamer, operator standing by for the text line, 541-661-4098. I was reading about the bus boycott.
Yes.
And what amazes me is with all these attacks against critical race theory, DEI, affirmative action, that's really recent history that we had some pretty ugly stuff going on back then and that was, what I've got is the Supreme Court in 1956. I was 4, but still recent history.
Yeah.
They came out with, it was illegal to segregate people riding buses. And then after that, or during that time, Dr. King was assaulted, his house was bombed, imprisoned, all of that stuff. I think his spirit for nonviolence had to overcome a lot of stuff.
Oh, for sure. Let me tell you a little more about his education. At Morehouse, he had mediocre grades, and that probably had to do with poor training in reading. But he had a lively mind, and he learned about a seminary in Pennsylvania. It was a small one. I think it had only like 40 students. It was named Crozier Theological Seminary, and the heritage it came from was from Congregationalists. Congregationalists were a kind of liberal, New England-based Christian denomination. And interestingly, while there, he became acquainted with several of the professors and leaders who were knowledgeable about Mahatma Gandhi and what was going on in India at the time. One of them, I think, had visited for a while, and it got King again becoming aware of ways to combat evil that do not create a lot of bloodshed, even if you're willing to accept bloodshed on your behalf. After that, he went to Boston University, their divinity school for theological training, and eventually got a PhD there. And there he especially became aware of and conversant with what was to be a lifetime mentor for him, Howard Thurman. Thurman, I believe, had been at Howard University, but then Boston asked him to come up there. It was, again, a school with a Methodist tradition, and he became the dean of the chapel and a professor there, and had studied extensively with Gandhi in India. And so there were some extraordinarily fine coincidences in King's life that led him to become the person he did become, as someone who advocated strongly through nonviolent direct action to combat evil in whatever form he found it. And when he was finishing up in college or at the seminary there in Boston, he met a woman, Coretta Scott King, or who became Coretta Scott King, who already herself had been an activist. In fact, he claimed that in many ways she was more than he was at that time in their lives. And she was a singer. She went to college in Ohio and looked for a concert career. But and King had previously had a fairly intense love affair with a white woman while at Crozier, but people advised that that was not wise if he wanted to be a prominent clergyman in the black church, and that was part of that background. When he was finishing up, his reputation was already becoming known as a very bright, gifted, talented man. He was ordained in his father's church in Atlanta at a younger age. He occasionally preached. And there were large black churches throughout the country that were interested in hiring him. And meanwhile, his father back in Atlanta wanted him to become his full-time assistant. And those were all, and there were some universities, including a historic black college in New Orleans called Dillard College, that wanted him as a professor, and these were all tempting. But another offer emerged, and that was from Montgomery, Alabama. Now, Montgomery historically was a major slave trading place. It was also the first capital of the Confederacy. It later moved to Richmond, Virginia, but it was the first. And a center and the capital of a state that was terribly oppressive of black people, especially when it came to voting. There was one county in near where Selma was called Lowndes County, which even in the 1950s, did not have one black person registered to vote. And anyway, King became the pastor at Dexter African Baptist Church in Montgomery. It's right downtown, right near the Capitol. And his wife had a baby, and he was there for about a year when Rosa Parks made her decision that she was tired and she did not want to give up her seat to a white man just simply because of the color of her skin. There had been incidents of that type in Montgomery ahead of time. The Montgomery NAACP was thinking of ways to deal with the issue. The U.S. Supreme Court decision on Brown versus Board of Education, which said that separate but equal facilities are not possible, especially when it applied to education, and that made a lot of people, a lot of black people and those who sympathized with them, optimistic that some change would happen. But King was one who clearly understood that if you want to bring about change, you just don't wait for it to happen. You're willing to take nonviolent, direct action that highlights the issue and gets attention in the press and puts pressure on the authorities and all that to bring about change that was right. Way back in 1896 or 98, I forget the year for sure, the U.S. Supreme Court in those days, ruling about trains and passages on trains, said that separate but equal facilities are okay, but they weren't, and they definitely were separate, but they were rarely equal.
Exactly.
And incidentally, going back to his Morehouse days, there was an arrangement between college people there, the administration, with some private tobacco company in Connecticut, of all places. I didn't know they raised tobacco in Connecticut. I thought it was a southern thing, where students from Morehouse could go and work for the summer. And if they stayed for the whole summer, they got their transportation back and forth, or that paid for. And King had his first exposure to the North at that time, and also the first exposure to trains and the separate but equal doctrine on trains. And I think they had to travel in a separate compartment or a part that was cut off in the train until they got as far as Baltimore, and then they could sit anywhere after that. So it was part of his own formative experiences. And in Montgomery, when the bus boycott started, there was a fairly well-established NAACP chapter that was struggling with these issues. There were some lawyers in town that were trying to get things changed. And when Rosa Parks was arrested and that all happened, the word got around quickly, thanks to mimeograph machines and some other primitive means of printing. And all of a sudden, the buses were not being boarded by what were often the majority of their passengers, which were black people. And it shut down the town in many ways. It went on for quite a while. And when it came time for a leadership, King was chosen, even though he was reluctant about it. He had a young child. He was new in town. He was just developing his style and all that. But he had remarkable rhetorical gifts, and there's in fact, I was listening to it a little while ago. There's an amazing recording of what he said at one of those first meetings. He had oratorical skills with his voice, with his pauses, with his body language, with his just people were moved by him, and it was people who were well educated and sophisticated, but also people who were just common folk who just caught in the moment the power of this man's gift. And as Rick mentioned earlier, he also soon found himself getting harassed in lots of different ways. There were bombs thrown at his house. There were physical violence against him and some of the colleagues, and he would get a lot of phone calls that were obscene and ugly and awful. And in one particular case, there was a phone call that used the N-word and said, you better get out of town soon, because in 3 days we're going to blow up your head and your house. And anyway, death threats to anyone are, whether real or unreal, are not easy to
I
receive.
think that required a great deal of courage for him to hang around after.
Oh, yeah.
Especially knowing that was actually a very real possibility.
Yeah, and a real specific time given.
Yeah, 3 days.
But in that particular incident, and it's become known as his kitchen epiphany. Epiphany was originally a theological word about a revelation of God's presence in one way or another, but it's also come to mean in literature, going back to James Joyce, that it's when something fairly simple happens every day, or maybe not so every day, but a time that is really life-defining and an important part of a story. And he made some coffee and prayed and said he heard an inner voice of God that basically said that you're fighting out for justice, you're fighting out for freedom, and I will be with you even until the end of the world. And from that time on, King had a really personal, intense feeling of a calling, and his calling involved, he realized the threat of death, but he was not going to stop because of that. He was willing to face whatever consequences he had to face, and indeed later on in his life he was stabbed once close to his heart. He was hit by bricks and stones and other things in Chicago when they tried to have events up there. In one famous incident in Selma, a leader of the Ku Klux Klan actually came to the office, or came to the hotel where King had been staying, and acted like he was being conciliatory, but then when he got close to Martin Luther King, he punched him in the face. And if you've seen the Selma movie, that's shown in that. And anyway, he from then on had a very difficult and troubled life, and he had this sense of urgency and a sense of calling and a sense of duty that he was to do what he was doing, and it was because God was a God of justice, and that he was called by that God to proclaim that justice. Any questions so far?
Well, I have interesting, yeah, about 50. No, but you talk about a calling, and that I was unaware that he wasn't, quote, you said the best student, let's say, maybe not on reading, writing, arithmetic, but he graduated from college at a young age, I believe.
Yes,
okay. Yeah. And also that calling, I was reading, though I never knew this, between 1957 and 1960, he had a zeal for this equality, for fighting injustice, like not a lot of people have, or very much more than I ever see from most people, but he traveled over 6 million miles and spoke over 2,500 times when he found, whether it was India or the United States or wherever. So he just had that, like you said, a calling. And he was a pretty special individual.
And that calling really complicated his life, the travel being an obvious example. He was often just going all around the country and beyond to raise his issues, and he was often asked to come and preach in churches. He was often asked to be a fundraising speaker for local versions of Southern Christian Leadership Council or other groups that he supported, and this didn't help his home life. And Coretta was pretty amazing. She raised 4 children while he was often gone. And he also found himself sometimes very, very tired, and he dealt with what nowadays would be called clinical depression. He was hospitalized several times for it, and other times he just had to take a big break. He was just going through so much. And that, again, also complicated his personal life. Everybody wanted to hear him speak and speak on their behalf, and organization developed from the bus boycott in Montgomery, which became the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. It was largely dominated by clergy, but it developed into an organization that was key in Selma and a lot of other places, and he became the leader of that with his good friend Ralph Abernathy, who was another pastor in Montgomery when the bus boycott took place.
Something referring to his ability to give a speech was years ago. I think it was in 96, 95. Anyway, I went to France with my wife, and it was the same year, the 50th anniversary of D-Day. So the whole whole beach there was geared up for tourism to come, and we were like a month before that, so it was very nice for us because there was lots of room. But anyway, we went to a D-Day museum there, or I guess a World War II museum that had just opened. And when you go, it was a typical museum. There's lots of dioramas and different things like that. But one of the first things you come upon is you will go into this large room that has a diorama of the D-Day invasion, and have all the little electronics and things like that. I don't remember exactly how it was all portrayed, but while you're looking at this diorama, they were playing the "I Have a Dream" speech.
Huh, okay.
Now, this is in France, where I'm sure you know, a lot of the people coming there, not only from France, but had no idea what he was saying.
They had no idea?
I would imagine. I mean,
because
unless he spoke English.
He was in France speaking the.
Oh, well.
He wasn't. They're playing a recording of it.
Right. Now, and I'm going to go back to that real quick. Robert, you were talking before about how that "I Have a Dream" speech was, or maybe it was Ray.
Me.
Okay. I apologize. How that was mostly extemporaneous, that wasn't written down, or most of it wasn't written down. And that was a pretty big moment.
Yeah. At the March in Washington, I went there. I was a young man, and it was quite the event. There were wonderful musicians who sang. Mahalia Jackson, probably the finest of the black gospel singers. Peter, Paul, and Mary, Bob Dylan. Harry. I'm not sure about Harry Belafonte, but Harry Belafonte played a very, very important role in the whole civil rights struggle.
I should point out, too, at the time of this speech and the time of March on Washington, Peter, Paul, and Mary and other people, entertainers, were not exactly praised for it by a lot of people. That was just a pretty daring thing to do.
The same type of distrust of Hollywood that one finds in spades these days was certainly around in those days. But let's go back a little earlier. After the bus boycott was remarkably effective, and part of it had to do with the discipline of those being involved in the struggle. King, and it's a famous week that happened, was one who went to a place called Highlander Folk School in Tennessee. And curiously, the same week that he went there, also there were Rosa Parks and Pete Seeger, who later adopted We Shall Overcome, which had been a labor song, to become a civil rights song. And but what happened at that place is they talked very seriously about the discipline that was necessary to conduct nonviolent direct action. And that meant turning the other cheek. It meant not striking back. It meant being willing to accept the consequences of what you were willing to do. And it meant being willing to continue to pursue things until things changed. And in the Montgomery case, it took over a year, and it really took the U.S. Supreme Court to affect the change that required the city of Montgomery to change its policies. And that was one of the first, earliest successful direct action, nonviolent event in the civil rights struggle, and was replicated in other places across the South. It followed with other struggles in the South. Birmingham was a huge one. That didn't focus on buses. It focused on the way in which blacks were treated in public facilities. You couldn't use this kind of water fountain, or you couldn't have your shoes tried on, or you couldn't eat at the lunch counter, and all of those kind of issues were directed in Birmingham, and it had a particularly outrageous head of public safety. He was in charge of both the police and the fire. Bull Connor was his name, and he was the biggest bully. His name. We have some bigger bullies these days, probably, but or more powerful bullies. Anyway, we've all seen the pictures of the fire hoses and the dogs, and there were people badly hurt, and part of the wonder of that particular struggle is school kids joined it. High school kids, they were winding up in jail. Hundreds were winding up in jail, and in that particular struggle, King wrote probably the most famous part of his writings, and that's called The Letter from the Birmingham Jail. He didn't have anything to normally write it on, so he started writing it on scraps of paper, toilet paper, newspaper, anything he could find. He had friends come in with other stuff, and it was in response to a letter that had been published locally that by local white clergy who were in that I find it despicable, but that slippery slope of saying, well, you're right, things should get better, but you're pushing too hard, you're going too fast, slow down, things will work out. And King's response was remarkably powerful in rebutting all those arguments.
That's kind of parallel, I think, now to the what I think about the LGBTQ movement.
Sure,
they're doing a lot of that.
Yeah.
Now,
by the way, I didn't quite answer the question about the March on Washington speech.
Okay.
The night before, a long draft of what was supposed to be the whole speech was worked out, and King, like many political figures, had ghostwriters. One was a Jewish northern attorney who had a lot of Communist Party affiliations and finances in his background, and became a strong advisor to Trump and someone that the FBI hated. And anyway, he had a written speech, and it went well, and the crowd was there. But at some point, Mahalia Jackson shouted out, "Tell him about the dream, Martin." And this was a speech that he had given, or part of a speech he had given a number of times in Detroit not too long ago. Mahalia had heard it there, I believe. And so he kind of left his written speech and went into that. And incidentally, there were some other things about the March on Washington that I find is troubling. One was the Kennedy administration, who were reluctant partners with King on stuff and were dealing with a Congress where especially the Senate was dominated by Southern racists. Anyway, the Kennedy administration wanted to see the text of all the speakers, and so did the Catholic Archbishop of Washington before he'd give the introduction. And one of the speakers that was controversial was John Lewis. John Lewis had his head bashed in the Selma incident, and was a young man more affiliated with SNCC than with SCLC. And he had a strong speech that got censored some. But the Kennedy administration made it clear that they wanted the right to turn off the sound system. And here's a crowd of 250,000, about 25% of us were white, but you don't fill that long Capitol Mall by the Lincoln Memorial and all that if you don't have a sound system. And that was one way of shutting them up if they felt it necessary. The day in Washington that day was very friendly. There were very few arrests all day. That may have had something to do with the fact with all the liquor stores were closed that day. I don't know about that. But anyway, to answer your question, much of his speech was pre-written, but the I have a dream part of it.
Okay.
And there's one thing that particularly disgusts me about how one phrase that he used in it about his children being judged not by the color of his skin, but the content of its character, is used by a lot of right-wingers to try and fight DEI and to
get those people out of the airport, out of the traffic controller.
Yeah. Don't let those people who should never have such a job have those jobs, even though they don't have those jobs. And
A little factoid maybe about that I Have a Dream speech. If you go to the Lincoln Memorial and you climb the steps, there's a little marker there that this is where Martin Luther King stood while he gave that speech. Can we shift gears a little bit? Now we've talked about the what I guess we call the nice guy parts of the civil rights movement, but there was also another end of it. I think a lot of, especially young people, probably got a little tired of the nonviolence, and I seem to recall that King's main thing was be patient. We're not going to see this in our lifetime, but our children and their children would see civil rights or would profit from that, and so they became a little more pushy.
Yeah, there were two elements that were crucial, especially in the South. SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Council, and SNCC, SNCC's Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the one was church people dominated, the other was student people dominated, and it was from that one that Stokely Carmichael was part of and developed the phrase Black Power. And there was a march in Mississippi where James Meredith who had previously been been involved in a dispute about entering the University of Mississippi, was shot during the march, and anyway, there was real serious tension between the stick people and to another in another way with the Malcolm X people who did not always say you had to be nonviolent.
That term, not a black power, was kind of misinterpreted a lot at times.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah,
I mean, but one thing about King, is he was not just talking about voting rights and public accommodations, and that he was talking about full economic justice and participation in a society that he thought of as should become the beloved community. And I had some of my own experiences in those civil rights days, and there are a couple I think I'd like to tell you a little about. When I was in, it's funny, I spent much of my youth involved in church youth work and being involved in a road toward the ministry, which I went through my 20s, but didn't get ordained till my 50s because I went in other directions for a long time. But meanwhile, I was in one of these schools in Indiana, and the governor, Ross Barnett from Mississippi, was the one who had kept James Meredith out of the University of Mississippi. And he came to Fort Wayne to get support. And I organized a bunch of students at my school to picket and confront, and I have a photograph with my holding a sign saying, "Do unto others, Governor Barnett." And it all seemed to go well until that evening. Me and some of my buddies, Lutherans were beer-drinking types, went out for a beer. And the first thing on the news that night was me. And people in the bar recognized me, and all of a sudden there was a lot of funny pointing around and something going on, and we weren't quite sure what. The bartender was getting something under the cash register, and we were thinking it might be a weapon, who knows. But it was a photo, a 9 or 8 by 10 glossy of a lynching. And I didn't know at the time, but that lynching was like 8 miles from there, not in the Deep South. Many lynchings were in the North. And they passed it around the room, and they were saying things like, oh, those students should learn, and the only thing worse than a N is an N lover. And they weren't talking about the letter of the alphabet. And they passed it to me and asked what I thought of it. And I said it was the most obscene thing I'd ever seen. Long, long silence. And then somebody cracked a joke or made a comment, and we decided it was time to get out of there. We weren't going to suggest singing Kumbaya. And some other things that happened with me were not quite that frightening, but well, the Republican National Convention was in San Francisco, Cow Palace, right near the border to Daly City. And it was the first real breakthrough of some of the real right-wing and racist elements of the Republican Party. Remember, the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln. At one time, Martin Luther King was actually registered as a Republican. But anyway, this was the Goldwater Convention with a lot of ugly race, and Goldwater had opposed the Civil Rights Bill and all of that. And anyway, there was about 1,000 of us who blocked the main entrance of the Cow Palace to make it difficult for them to leave when the session was over. And we went through preparations to what to do and being willing to be arrested and all that. And anyway, the convention people chose to ignore us, let them out some side entrances, and we just sat there for 4 or 5 hours and nothing really happened. And that happened a couple times in some hotels and car shops in San Francisco as well.
Another thing that occurred during that time that was greatly misunderstood, to include me, was the rise of the Black Panthers. And the Black Panthers began, Huey Newton, and I cannot remember the other guy's right name. That's
Bobby Seale.
Bobby Seale. We're seeing all these black people at traffic stops and things like that being beaten up and abused in some way. And at the time in California, it was legal to carry a loaded firearm as long as it was in public view. You couldn't have a concealed weapon, but you could carry a AR-15 or whatever. I don't think they were even invented yet. But you could carry shotguns or whatever. And what they would do is follow police cars around until the police car stopped a black person, and then they just got out of their car and they stayed far enough away that they were not interfering. But
And they had law books with them.
yeah, and they would definitely be very intimidating to any cop stopping somebody as a retired.
Well, wait till they walked into the floor of the California legislature. That really scared people. I see our time is a little going, and I want to mention one other incredibly important part about King's life, and that had to do with the war in Vietnam. He early on had misgivings about it. He connected with a famous Buddhist monk, Thich Nhat Hanh. I get his name mixed up every time. They met several times in Chicago, and he gave a famous speech at Riverside Church in New York City in which he said that violence or injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And he got in trouble with a lot of his supporters and a lot of media because of this. There was, of course, a strong student movement going on and all that, but a lot of people saying, "Oh, you're messing up the civil rights struggle by opposing this war." And even though this war was not justified, it was in a country with people who were not white, and an enormous amount of bombs and napalm and many things of that sort were. And King was just insistent that he can't be talking about having justice in the American South and not justice in a place where we have no business being.
Well, and to me, I hate to kind of end, we're running down, but end on a downer a little bit, but for as great as he was, and the movement for nonviolence was building, I think at the time, or at a time, I don't see it around much these days. It seems like that message has been not lost, but definitely weakened a bit.
I think so. And a lot of
What message are you talking about?
Nonviolence,
Oh, okay.
equality.
a lot of it has to do with all the guns that have
I agree.
Escalated since that time,
And the love of guns.
and the love of guns, and
And the fear of not having your gun.
Well, yeah.
and a lot of the slacking back was the assumption that things were gradually going to get better, and they haven't, and the assumption that somehow people were getting tired or materialistic, or somehow other things became more important in their lives. I thought things would be much better by now.
I did too.
Speaking of which, I'm glad you brought that up because I did want to get your opinion on. I hear a lot of people say, as far as the blacks are concerned, that they really haven't made a whole lot of progress. I guess I'm not seeing the whole picture, but I think there's been a whole lot of progress. There's a lot yet to be made. When I was a kid, or not even then, much later in my life, if I had made a doctor's appointment out of the phone book, I'd never seen him before, and a black doctor walked in, I might have been a little surprised that there was such a thing. Or when the pilot was getting on the jet you're about to fly across the country was black, it'd be kind of shocking. And now I think there's much less of that, if any of it.
Well, there still are a lot of people who just say, I'd never go to a black doctor, or I wouldn't fly in a plane if I knew the pilot was black.
Still are.
There are a lot of people, but I think at least now that black doctor and that black pilot exists. And,
yeah, exists. Not in big percentages, but definitely do exist.
In communities like Brookings, of course, we don't see it because there are virtually no black people here, but in other communities that are mixed race, is it still like it used to be? I mean, black people can buy a house now in most places, probably. And,
still harder.
harder, yeah. I didn't say things were perfect, but
I know.
To say that there's been little or no improvement, I think is
people can jump one end or the other, but I agree that progress has been made, but I also agree that, especially with this administration, it's starting to be pulled back.
Yeah, all bets are off when we talk about anything as far as progress goes with this administration.
Another thing about King in the civil rights era is in the late 60s, things started to go bad. For one thing, King was invited to do stuff in Chicago, but there were not people on his side who were used to the type of discipline and willingness to accept violence and all that. But there were also whites in the North, in Chicago and Cicero and places like that were kind of more overtly, violently racist than some white people in the South. And in Chicago, they did try to deal with the housing issue. King was amazing. He was meeting with the mayor of Chicago, Richard Daley. He was meeting with Lyndon Johnson. He was meeting with Bobby Kennedy. And he was a really important figure in our national life. But things were going bad with him, especially with the Chicago effort, and also when the opposition of the War of Vietnam was taking place. King was in deep, deep trouble. And he was often conscious of the thought that he might be assassinated. And the speech the night before he was illustrates something that he often had to cope with, and probably had to do with a lot of the depression he dealt with and some of the other activities he engaged in.
Well, yeah, and we are running down, a couple of minutes left. What I will say, first of all, thank you, Robert, for filling us in on all of that stuff, a lot of the stuff I didn't know. And here we are, three white guys in the middle of Black History Month talking about it. Maybe that's some success that's going on. But I still think there's a long way to go from what I see.
There clearly is a long way to go throughout the land. And I just hope that people who understand these things do what they can personally in whatever ways they can to try and make it a better place.
Yep.
I thought I'd mention there's some excellent books out. Clay-borne Carson has a book which he calls the Autobiography of Martin Luther King. It was actually edited by him. Coretta Scott King gave the King Papers to Stanford University. He was a black professor there, and I studied with him some, and he's a very impressive man. There are also a three-book set by Taylor Branch, and a one-book set earlier by, and those are called Canaan and Parting of the Waters, and the other one called Bearing the Cross is by another writer from like 30, 40 years ago.
Okay.
But the most important one that's come out recently is by a man named Jonathon Eig.
Okay, we do have to go. We're signing off. We just wanted to remind everybody it's KCIW LP, Brookings, Oregon. Thank you, Robert, for being our guest.
And thank you, all of you out there, for listening.